is ironic the way it sometimes is that in our service about structure and freedom, our joy of the music and everything else, that we are at near the end of our time, and I'm still going to preach to you. So I'll just let you know that if you need to leave, I will not be offended. But I've waited 4 weeks to be up here with you. I'm going. Now, I was a kid in the 1960s and the 1970s, and freedom was the thing. My parents raised me outside of any kind of formal religion. I was an early nun, because they wanted me to have the freedom to choose my own religion when I grew up, or at least that's what they said. I also was given the freedom to choose my own middle name. Now, the good news is I did find a religion, this one, in my mid-20s. Though when I was growing up, in some times of great distress, I could have actually used one then as well. And the other news is that I still do not have a middle name. Decades later, I'm still NMI. No middle initial. We have a lot of mythologies around freedom. Now, on this Memorial Day, we're going to hear a lot about freedom. We do every year. People around the country will celebrate the freedom that we have here in the name of democracy. But as they do so, what we may not ever hear stated in the speeches and the news clips is that we are also celebrating the structure of democracy and the democratic processes which were tested on the soils of this nation in the earliest days of its founding. Now, those democratic ideas from Europe came over, they were blended with the structures that were already indigenous here. The people of the Six Nations, also known more by the name the French colonizers gave them, the Iroquois, had a model of confederated democracy, and this new structure was studied by Benjamin Franklin, by Thomas Jefferson. Freedom, as we will hear on days such as tomorrow, will be praised to the high heavens. But like every other aspect of life, it has its limits. People wanted the freedom to have slaves, and that is actually why we had the war that led to the first Memorial Day, as Bob pointed out. And in our time, our nation has created an economy so unregulated that we and the rest of the world are being held hostage to a runaway ethic of consumption. One has only to think about what has happened in recent years, and particularly recent weeks, to the phrase religious freedom to see the downsides of focusing only on one aspect of this partnership between freedom and structure. And as I was reminded by a robocall this week from College Park High School, which was announcing a case of whooping cough in the school now, the freedom to choose has led to the resurrection of many dangerous diseases that had almost been wiped out among us. So those of us not engaged in the benevolent dictatorship of physical therapy have the freedom to exercise however we want, but we have to choose a path and stick with it, where we're not likely to lose those extra inches, or what the fitness folks now graphically describe as the muffin tops. And we know about freedom and structure in our relationships as parents as well, and as children, that balancing act, and also the irony that kids parented by parents who are too authoritative, and also kids parented by parents who are give them too much freedom, actually end up with many of the same pathologies. So there's that dance between structure and freedom. And it's reflected in the fact that one website promotes what it calls authoritative democratic parenting. Think about that. Still kind of wrapping my mind around it. Every structure we know, every structure needs criticism. And in the 1960s, when I was coming up, many of the structures of our lives around us were criticized. There was the Black empowerment movement, there was the peace movement, which was so important here. There was the movement for women's rights, among those emerging. In 1970, a woman named Jo Freeman in 1970 offered a critique of the women's movement. She called it the tyranny of structurelessness. in case you've been wondering where I came up with that not-so-catchy sermon. Her analysis was so perceptive that the article has been reproduced for decades since in a variety of settings. When I was looking for a copy to pass on to Bob for our preparation for this sermon, I actually found one on a site promoting anarchy. Think about that. An article about the tyranny of structurelessness on a site promoting anarchy. So the truths are so great, even the anarchists approve. But here are Freeman's words. Contrary to what we would like to believe, there is no such thing as a structureless group. Any group of people, whatever nature, coming together for any length of time, for any purpose, will inevitably structure itself in some fashion. The structure may be flexible, it may vary over time, it may be evenly or unevenly distributed. Power and resources may fluctuate among the members of the group, but it will be formed regardless of the abilities, personalities, and intentions of the people involved. The very fact that we are individuals with different talents, predispositions, and backgrounds makes this inevitable. Only if we refuse to relate or interact on any basis whatsoever can we approximate structurelessness, and that is not the nature of a human group. She goes on to say this. Thus, structurelessness becomes a way of masking power. And within the women's movement today, 1970, it is usually most strongly advocated by those who are already the most powerful, whether they are conscious of their power or not. The rules of how decisions are made are known only to a few, and awareness of power is curtailed by those who know the rules, as long as the structure of the group is informal. Those who do not know the rules and are not chosen for initiation must remain in confusion or suffer from paranoid delusions that something is happening of which they are not quite aware. For everyone to have the opportunity to be involved in a given group and to participate in its activities, the structure must be explicit, not implicit. The rules of decision-making must be open and available to everyone, and this can happen only if they are formalized. This relationship between structure and freedom weaves through our lives. We all know that feeling, kind of the third or fourth day of vacation. It doesn't happen the first or second. When all of a sudden we have this sudden urge to have some kind of a plan to get through the day. We know it in our attempts to live in a better in the world and to make the world better around us. Each generation rightfully bucks against traditions, and yet trying to be against convention can in itself become a kind of convention itself. And in liberal religion, we know that it's not enough to have the freedom of belief. You also have to have enough of those sheltering walls to discern what you do believe and then to make it operative in your actual life. I suspect that I'm not alone in identifying myself as having been the victim of bullying. There are probably a few other people out there who have experienced that in their life. I was bullied on the bus on the way to school for almost all of my 6th grade year. I was a kid with a weird last name, living with very limited economic means. I was an easy target in an atmosphere where it was tolerated. And day after day, it was witnessed by the other kids, and it was witnessed by the driver whose job did not include enforcing civility. But why? Think about it. Why does bullying occur on the bus and on the playground, in the cafeteria, and in the halls? Because these are the most unstructured times in a school day. And in these times, the powerful, whom Freeland in her article describes as the elite, ascend. She says the absence of structure means that those with social power will rule. There are 2 potentially negative consequences of which we should be aware, she says. The first is that the informal structure of decision-making will become like that of a sorority, one in which people listen to others because they like them, not because they say significant things. And as long, she goes on to say, as the movement doesn't want to do significant things, it doesn't matter. Because in informal structures, there is no obligation to be responsible to the group at large. The group cannot compel such responsibility. It becomes dependent. on the interests of the elite. So to live without structure can be exhausting. But we're also reminded by the lessons of the Lord of the Flies, which I suspect we were reminded of through our quick breeze-through summary there. But we're reminded by those lessons that it's not that people are bad, it's that we need those sheltering walls to keep hate out and hold love in. They may be thin, but we need those walls. To live without structure is exhausting, which we learn through the madness of leadership group projects in high school or college, or where we learn more terribly sometimes through the free-floating non-action of depression and despair. The structure outlines the borders of the canvas upon which we are free to splash paint any way we can. And it also, most importantly, allows us to come together in a healthy way across lines of difference and have equal participation. This Memorial Day, pundits will talk and talk about freedom, and yet only 36% of the people in our county exercised their right to vote in the last election. And despite the fact that the democratic process, as I lifted up in our greeting, is named as one of the principles that binds us together, often far less than half of us exercise our right to vote in our processes here as well. In these new times, we need to think about the ways we are called together. Last weekend, I was privileged to be part of a panel talking about the future of Unitarian Universalism. And we talked about the Pew study, which Bob noted, and we talked about the fact that the world is changing very fast, and the religious landscape is changing faster than most. We talked about the fact that in our congregations, we have a tension between those who came in as a reaction against something, whether it was religious injury or trauma, or conservative values which negated their wholeness, and people who come in looking for something. And we need structures that can honor both. Now, on the Sunday mornings during my sabbatical, I figured out what people who don't spend all Sunday morning here do. It was really revelatory. I went to the farmer's market. I meditated on top of Mount Diablo with a congregation of inquisitive hummingbirds. I took longer walks with my greyhounds, and I thought about how wonderful that was, and how glad I was that I was coming back to this, the structure of community. When I was in college, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he began to dismantle government, not only in terms of the real dollars, but in terms of our attitudes towards it. And then a few years later, Newt Gingrich came along and created a movement out of suspicion and distrust. And around these same times, we began to give unprecedented freedom to corporations to engage in an epic of hyper-consumption. And the promise became not what can we build together, but what can we buy for ourselves. Let us not be fooled on this day before Memorial Day. This is not collective liberty. It is now individual freedom raised up to our highest grade. And our children, our schools, our human infrastructure, the very environment which we live in requires us to act. We need to build something new and not just tear things down. And that acting requires re-engaging with the jazz dance between structure and freedom. Maybe because my Japanese-American dad, born right here in California, was interned at the age of 4. But I'm not a big fan of these uber-patriotic holidays, as you can imagine. However, I am a big fan of the structures of democracy, which still give us the opportunities to put our largest dreams for one another into play. Our dreams for our world and our dreams for ourselves. So I will choose to spend tomorrow thinking not only of those who lost their lives, which we always must remember, but also to be grateful for the structures of democracy which allow us to live our lives at the greatest limit and not the least common denominator of who we can be. So let us tomorrow be the ones to hold this fuller view of our freedom, this wholehearted belief in the power and the promise of our